Okay, well, the method of Austrian economics, at least as understood in the Misesian tradition, is a priori. And although that term has been thrown around a bit, I don't know whether you've actually been sort of formally introduced to it. There's a distinction between the terms a priori and a posteriori. A priori is Latin for on the basis of what is prior, and a posteriori means on the basis of what is posterior, where we're talking about what's prior or posterior to experience. Now, when we talk about something being a priori, being known prior to experience, that doesn't mean that if you've been raised in a sensory deprivation bubble and never had any sensory experience, you would then, come up with these a priori truths. That's not the sense in which it means. There have been some philosophers who thought that. There's a prominent medieval Arabic philosopher, Avicenna, who came up with his theory of the floating man, where if a man were raised floating in a tank and never had any external sensory experience, he'd be able to deduce his own existence, the existence of God, and various other interesting things. But that's not what is generally meant by a priori. It generally means it's, different philosophers mean different things by it. It means something like prior to experience of the subject in question. So, for example, if you know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, you don't actually have to go and investigate all the particular combinations of 2 and 2 in the world to make sure they really do add up to 4. And that's the sense in which 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a priori. It's known independent of having to go and empirically test that proposition. So a priori propositions are propositions that do not have to be empirically tested to be known. Excuse me. And so, of course, this theory comes up against those views that hold that everything, or at least everything interesting, or just about everything interesting, has to be empirically tested to be known. Now, Mises never claimed that he was introducing a brand new method, that he was coming along to economics that had been languishing in its awful empirical methods, and he was coming along and giving it a brand new method of being a priori. What he claimed is that economics had always been a priori, not in terms of the official methodology accepted by its practitioners in their official statements of what they're doing, but rather in their actual practice. And what people do when they announce their official theory of what they're doing, and what they do when they're actually doing it, are often two very different things. So, although many of the early economists were empiricists of some kind in their conscious philosophical convictions, and talked about what they were doing as an empirical method, Mises looked at the actual arguments they were giving, the actual sorts of evidence they were willing to consider, and so forth, and he concluded that he was simply making explicit an a priori commitment that was already there. Well, this a priori method comes up against the theory of logical positivism, which you've heard a few times this week. Logical positivism is called that to both ally itself with and distinguish itself from what was earlier called just positivism. Positivism was a movement founded by Auguste Comte, and I have his name and dates down here. He was a very prominent and influential thinker. There's a big statue of him in front of the Sorbonne in Paris. And he came up with the idea that the history of thought goes through 3 stages. First, there's the religious stage, when you interpret natural phenomena in terms of personal causation. So, in the first stage, you interpret the events that happen as the will of God, or of the gods, or of spirits, and so forth. And then we pass by that immature stage to the second, philosophical or metaphysical phase, where we interpret phenomena not in terms of the personal wills of agents, but in terms of metaphysical forces essences and so on. And then finally we get to the final stage, the positivist stage, where philosophy, theology, social science all give way to or adopt the methods of the natural sciences. And so we stop interpreting things in terms of any kind of causation that goes beyond sensory experience. We no longer appeal to gods, we no longer appeal to souls or free-willed selves or anything like that. We simply use statistical and empirical methods to understand human behavior. Now, for an anti-theological view, Comte's view had a rather religious ring to it. He founded these positivist churches that worshipped humanity, and there's still, in certain parts of Latin America, there's still some of these positivist churches survive. Well, also his politics, as you may know, were horrible. He wanted a board of technocrats to control every aspect of society. Well, the logical positivists called themselves positivists because they were seeing themselves as, to some extent, in Comte's tradition. They thought that the methods of the natural sciences were the proper model for the social sciences to follow. They wanted to get rid of any theological or metaphysical speculation. But they weren't really positivists in all the same senses that Comte was. They weren't committed to any particular theory of history. They certainly were not interested in founding positivist churches, and they weren't necessarily committed to any one particular political view. I mean, the different logical positivists, ranged all over the map as far as their political views went. Mostly pretty bad stuff, but most political views are pretty bad. But there wasn't any one particular theory that they were hooked to. The main center of logical positivism was the Vienna Circle, or the Wiener Kreis, which met in the same city or during the same era as the Mises Kreis did, and had some common membership. Felix Kaufmann, the guy who was responsible for writing the songs we heard the other night, was a member of both circles. Ludwig's brother Richard was a member of the Mises Kreis. I just put a couple of names down, Schlick and Hempel. For those of you who heard David Gordon's talk a few days ago, you know that Schlick made the fatal mistake of giving one of his students a bad grade. One of the crucial things that the logical positivists introduced, that you don't really find in Comte, was this notion of verificationism. And the motto that the verificationist idea is supposed to embody is: the meaning of a statement is its method of verification. Is statements in philosophy are often very odd. This is one of them. What does this mean? What does it mean to say that? To say what a statement means is to say what the method of verifying the statement is. Well, here's how it was explained to me in the very first philosophy course I ever took, back in the fall of 1981. A Druid meets a logical positivist. One of those parties where they bring together people from various points of view. So the Druid meets the logical positivist, and the Druid starts striking up a conversation, says, "There are spirits in the trees." And the logical positivist replies, exactly as a logical positivist would, "What do you mean by that?" And the Druid said, "Well, haven't you noticed that in the fall, the leaves on the trees turn all these beautiful colors, and then they fall off, and the tree is bare. But in the spring, suddenly new green leaves come sprouting out. Obviously, there are spirits in the trees." And the logical positivist says, "Ah, now I understand. When you say there are spirits in the trees, what you mean is in the fall, the leaves turn colors and fall off. In the spring, new green leaves come out. Sure, if that's all you mean, then I agree. Yes, there are spirits in the trees. We can be brothers. So, what the logical positivist thought was that statements that seem to refer to unobservables should be reinterpreted wherever possible as really referring to observables, referring to things you can test. The only meaningful part of a statement is the part that can be empirically tested. And they saw as one of the advantages of this the fact that it allowed them to solve the philosophical problem of skepticism. If you ask, well, how do you really know such and such? Like, suppose you're someone who's a skeptic about atoms. You can't see atoms. We have all these scientific theories, and they seem to work very well. We've got all these scientific theories that all this evidence from which we infer atoms, but we can't see them directly. So how couldn't we be wrong? And the logical positivist is going to say no. When you say there are atoms, all you mean is that certain kinds of experiments turn out certain kinds of ways. And so all talk about theoretical, unobservable entities isn't banished from the language the way that Kant might have been tempted to do. Instead, it's reinterpreted, whenever it can be, in terms of observable, publicly verifiable statements. And they saw the task of science as being prediction. Not explanation, but prediction. For those of you who heard my talk about Milton Friedman on methodology, you can see that this is sort of the ancestor of Friedman's view on this. For the more mainstream view, the reason that we talk about atoms is we want to explain the results of our experiments. We go into the laboratory, we turn on all this cool equipment, and the needles go vroom vroom, and all these things happen, and we appeal to the existence of atoms and electrons and protons and all this cool stuff to explain why we get these measurements. So science has traditionally seen its role as explaining things. But the positivists thought, well, it doesn't really explain things. Explaining weird stuff that happens at the visible level by appealing to other weird stuff that happens at the invisible level is no good. What we really want to do is predict. We want to predict what will happen when we do this and that. And talking about atoms is a shorthand for making these predictions. So they weren't just wanting to apply to the natural sciences to the social sciences the method of the natural sciences. They wanted to apply to the social sciences their conception of the method of the natural sciences. And it's questionable whether it really was even the method of the natural sciences, whether they even got that right. Now, Karl Popper, whose name has come up several times this week, is sometimes described as the archenemy of logical positivism. And he's sometimes described as a minor variant of logical positivism. And you might wonder, well, which is it, and why is he described both these ways? Well, I think it's somewhere in between. I think he's not really just a variant of logical positivism, but I think he's closer to logical positivism than he himself thought. Popper, in one of his books, wrote that he asked the question, who killed logical positivism? And he says, well, I have to confess I did it. So he certainly didn't think of himself as a positivist. He thought that he was the one responsible for the death of positivism. He had a healthy self-esteem. But people say that the big difference between Popper and the positivists is that the positivist talks about verification, whereas Popper talks about falsification, where falsification is, rather than trying to use evidence to show that something is true, use evidence to show that it's false. So, for example, if I want to show that if I'm interested in this claim that all styrofoam floats in water, well, just looking at some styrofoam floating in water doesn't guarantee that it all would. Maybe there are different kinds of styrofoam. But at least it's something you could refute. If just one case styrofoam doesn't float in water, you've refuted it. So he focused on falsification. But that contrast can be misleading, because when the positivists talked about verification, they didn't mean anything quite as precise as what Popper meant by falsification. By verification, they meant something like any kind of empirical test. So they would have said, well, some statements are more appropriately verified, some falsified, just any kind of empirical test, and he was really narrowing it down. But the important difference between Popper and the positivists is that falsification was not a criterion of meaning for Popper. Popper did not think that only falsifiable, and therefore only empirically testable, statements were meaningful. He thought that they were the only ones that were scientific, and he was interested in what's called the demarcation problem. How do you distinguish science from things that are not scientific? And he thought that falsification was the key. A statement is falsifiable only if it carries with it some criteria for determining what empirical tests would prove it wrong. But he thought there were valid uses for non-falsifiable statements, namely as part of research programs, a general speculative framework that would help us formulate hypotheses and so on. So he wasn't as radical in that sense as the positivists. And toward the end of his life, he focused less on empirical falsifiability and more on this broader notion of criticizability. As long as something is open to criticism, the criticism doesn't necessarily have to take the form of empirical refutation. So those are some of the senses in which he was kind of different from the positivists. But he was like the positivists in denying the possibility of knowing very much a priori. He thought you could know logic and mathematics a priori because he thought those weren't about the world. Those are simply sort of just ways of organizing our language. But he didn't think that you could know any interesting facts about reality a priori. Now, why did verificationism have such strong appeal? I think the reason it did is, I think that generally, false philosophical theories, because I do think verificationism is false, false philosophical theories often have some grain of truth to them, some bit of truth that has attracted people, and the reason they're drawn to the false theory is that they're maybe drawn to the true bit of it. And so it's a true theory misperceived. One reason for thinking the verification thesis is false is one that Professor Hoppe mentioned in an earlier lecture, which is that it can't survive being applied to itself. If a meaningful statement has to be empirically testable, I was trying to say verifiable and testable at the same time, and that's what happens. If a meaningful statement has to be empirically testable, what about that statement? The statement, a meaningful statement has to be empirically testable. Guess that would have to be empirically testable too. But how do you test it? How do you test that statement? What would count as an empirical verification of that? You'd have to have some independent criterion of meaning, and then check all the meaningful things and see if they're testable too. But the whole point of this was there was no independent criterion of meaning. And criterion of meaning just was verifiability. So the statement doesn't seem to withstand application to itself. But I think there is a core of truth to verificationism. It's the core of truth that led people astray. And this is an idea that you can find in both Wittgenstein and Ayn Rand. Namely, that the ability to apply a concept is part of having the concept. In other words, you don't count as having a concept unless you've got some ability to apply it. Not perfectly every time necessarily, but reasonably reliably. So for example, I don't count as having the concept of chair if I can't actually identify things as chairs. If I have the concept of chair, I have to be able to actually recognize chairs in my experience. I don't have to get it right every time. The lighting could be bad, or I could mistake a chair for a non-chair or a non-chair for a chair occasionally. But if you ask me to point to the chairs in this room, I just sort of randomly think, well, maybe that, this, that. Occasionally point at an actual chair. This, those things. If I just sort of or if I just throw up my hands and say, well, there may be some chairs in this room, but I can't tell. Unless I have some genuinely reliable ability to identify chairs, it seems hard to say that I have the concept. Both Wittgenstein and Rand thought that part of possessing an abstract concept is the ability to apply it to concrete reality. And so what that would mean is that if you're just completely unable to identify any instances of the thing you're talking about in your experience, or point to any kind of application of them, then you don't count as, what you're saying doesn't count as meaning anything, because you don't actually, no concept actually corresponds to your words. I think that idea is what led, well, I don't just think it, I know it, because the positivists thought that they'd gotten their verifications theory from Wittgenstein. They were big fans of Wittgenstein. He was not big fans of them, but they were big fans of him. They thought of themselves as followers and interpreters of Wittgenstein, and used to go around quoting him and saying, oh, Dr. Wittgenstein says, Professor Wittgenstein says. A lot of people in Vienna who didn't know Wittgenstein thought that Wittgenstein was a fictional character invented by the logical positivists, that he was sort of their imaginary spokesman. And of course, in a sense, he was, because the Wittgenstein that they were quoting wasn't really the real Wittgenstein. And when they finally invited him out to Vienna, invited him back to Vienna to meet with him, they soon found out that they were not on the same wavelength. Because although Wittgenstein did think that you had to have some sort of ability to apply a concept in order to count as having it, he certainly never thought that there was any kind of mechanical test where you could just simply exhaustively define the meaning of something simply in terms of its verification. He didn't think you could identify the verification apart from the meaning. So I think this is a case of their picking up on a good idea but running off with it, which something happens a lot in the history of philosophy. Someone comes up with some insight which is correct, but then they blow it up into being the universal thing. Like, the first Greek philosopher, Thales, figures out there's a lot of water around and it's really important. That's right. And he goes from that to everything is water, and that's less right. Okay, one of the positions that the positivists and the Popperians agree on is this notion of a dichotomy between analytic and synthetic statements, where analytic statements are statements that are true by definition. And they would have said something like, all bachelors are unmarried is true by definition. That's why you can know it a priori. They would grant you could know that a priori, but they thought that doesn't really tell you anything about the world. It just amounts to a decision not to call anything a bachelor unless it's unmarried. That's why you don't have to go out and do empirical polls and ask bachelors if they're married and report, what percentage of bachelors turn out to be married, what percentage not. They just thought, well, it's just sort of a linguistic stipulation. Whereas synthetic statements that give you some substantive information that doesn't just derive from your linguistic conventions, those are the synthetic statements. And those cannot be known a priori. They can only be known through empirical testing. And of course, you can see why this would be an obstacle to their accepting this Misesian notion of praxeology, because praxeological statements are supposed to be known a priori, but they're not just supposed to be merely linguistic stipulations. They're supposed to really tell us something about the nature of reality. Now, Immanuel Kant, who is responsible for coming up with the terms analytic and synthetic, though I think the concepts were already around before, he, unlike the positivists, had thought there were synthetic a priori statements. That is, statements that tell us something substantive about reality, but which can nevertheless be known a priori. But his account of it involved the mind having these innate categories which it uses to structure its experience, and the positivists thought that all sounded very weird, and they didn't want that. Now, it's hard to say what Wittgenstein's position on analytic synthetic is. It's not hard to say what it is because we don't know what it is. It's hard to say what it is because it's hard to know how to categorize it. Remember, Wittgenstein thinks you don't count as having concepts unless you can identify instances of the concept. So, while in a sense he believes that there are purely conceptual truths that are just true by definition in some sense, Nevertheless, there are also I don't know whether empirical is the right word or not. There are truths about reality that you have to know in order to be able to use the concept at all. And therefore, certain concepts certain statements you just couldn't coherently assert, because there would be statements whose falsity is a presupposition of being able to use the concept at all. Those might be the equivalent of synthetic a priori truths for him. Okay, well, Mises' approach, the praxeological approach generally, is one of sort of a three-way tangle between praxeology on the one hand, positivism on the other hand, and on the third hand, historicism. The historicists and the positivists disagreed with each other as much as they did with Mises. The historicists thought that the positivists were wrong to try and make the social sciences imitate the methods of the natural sciences. The historicists thought, and Mises would agree with them on this, the historicists thought it's crucial that in the case of understanding human behavior, we are human beings understanding our fellow human beings and understanding it in terms of the meanings, subjective meanings attached to those actions by the doers. And so the historicists would have been big on the notion that in order to understand human behavior, you have to understand it in terms of the beliefs and desires of the behaving agent. And that's radically different from the natural sciences, where we talk about various external forces impinging on things, but you don't have to get into the mind. If you're following the trajectory of the apple as it falls from the tree, you don't have to get into the mind of the apple to see why it's wanting to fall. But if you want to understand human behavior, you can't just talk about the forces impinging on them. You've got to actually understand it in terms of the subjective meaning of that action to the participants. So they were what Mises calls methodological dualists, thinking that there are two different methodologies, to Bob Murphy, two different methods. Methodology is the study of method. Two different methods, one appropriate to the natural sciences and another to the social sciences. So Mises would like that about the historicists, did like that about the historicists. These are the better historicists. I'm not sure that this description really applies to the Schmollerites. The Schmollerites were, we're talking more here about people like Winkelband and Rickert and Dilthey and Collingwood. But they did not. The historicists did not think that there were any universal laws in social sciences, because there aren't any universal laws about what people want or desire. People want and desire all kinds of stuff. You could try and come up with generalizations about what people tend to want and desire, but there are going to be so many exceptions. Think of Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire to protest the Vietnam War. That happened a few times. Well, setting yourself on fire is, or take another example, Bertrand Russell's granddaughter setting herself on fire because she was bummed out. Setting yourself on fire is not the sort of thing most people want to do. So it's a pretty reliable assumption most of the time that people are not going to want to set themselves on fire, but sometimes they do. And sometimes they have political reasons, sometimes they have personal reasons. Who knows? Just sometimes people want all kinds of weird stuff. So you can't, and what people want is so determined by or influenced by their cultural surroundings and all kinds of things, and you can't really come up with any general laws for that. And so the historicists said, there are no universally applicable laws in social science. That's another way, they thought, in which it differs from the natural sciences. And so, of course, you can't know a priori anything about human action. You have to go and try to understand and interpret people's behavior. Now, the positivists thought that there are universal social laws. They thought that social science could be a genuine science. And Mises would like that. But the reason they thought that is they thought that methodological dualism was wrong. They thought that the social sciences should imitate the natural sciences. You go out looking for empirical correlations and try and find the ultimate laws that govern human psychology. Well, Mises is going to agree with the historicists that social science is different from natural science, and that it differs in focusing on the subjective meaning and value of actions to the doers. But he's going to agree with the positivists that universal social laws are possible. And the reason is because Mises isn't just a methodological dualist. He's a methodological trialist, a threealist, because he thinks there are actually three different levels of description. There's the level he calls praxeology. In his early writings, before he came up with the term praxeology, he sometimes called it sociology, although that's obviously ambiguous, which is why he switched to praxeology, the logic of action. Sometimes he just calls it theory. And he contrasts that with the term that eventually he would use themology, but sometimes he calls it psychology, or sometimes literary psychology, not a term he invented, but people who pursued psychology in a very physicalistic way, where they understood psychology as a matter of showing you some food and measuring how much your pupils dilate, or whether the electrical conductivity of your skin changes or anything. Think that's real scientific psychology. And talking about people's feelings, that's just literary psychology. So sometimes people called it that. And Mises sometimes calls it history. I'm not suggesting that themology and history are synonyms for Mises, but I haven't never been able to figure out exactly what the relationship is. Sometimes one seems like it's a subset of the other, sometimes not. But anyway, it's the understanding of people's actions in terms of those actions' meaning to them. Whereas naturalistic psychology is studying human beings as though they were just any further scientific object of study. And there's nothing wrong with that, Mises thinks. There's nothing wrong with showing you some food and measuring how much your pupils dilate, or studying the neurons of your brain, just studying the purely physical side of what you're doing. That's useful, but he thinks it's distinct from understanding psychologically your desires, which would be themology. But that in turn is distinct from praxeology, which is studying these very general principles about the nature of action that don't depend on imputing to you any particular motive. Praxeology doesn't take any position on whether you're likely to want to set yourself on fire. This is one of the ways in which Mises takes issue with some of his predecessors, who thought that in order to do economics they had to attribute some very specific desires to people. And they sometimes thought that, but they didn't always. They weren't consistent. Praxeology is not about what motives we have. It's about what counts as having a motive, what counts as acting on a motive, what we have to be able to say about a person in order for them to count as behaving voluntarily rather than just twitching. So, one way of describing Mises' objection to both the historicists and the positivists is the positivists act as though all there is naturalistic psychology. They want to reduce the study of human behavior and human understanding and motives just to as if it's just more reflexes and twitches. The historicists are better than the positivists in that they recognize themology. They don't use that term, but they recognize trying to understand people's actions in terms of their beliefs and desires. But the reason that they deny the existence of sociological laws is they think that's as far as you can go. And Mises agrees with them that there aren't really any interesting laws in themology. The universal laws come in at the level of praxeology, which has to do with conceptual analysis of the nature of action. Now, Mises is often accused of thinking that you can derive all sorts of very specific empirical views about psychology just from these abstract concepts. Friedman, for example, says that Mises thought you could know all sorts of things about the motives of human action a priori. But that's to confuse the praxeological and the thymological level. So, for example, it's not a praxeological question. It's a thymological question whether there actually is money in a particular economy. If you go to an economy and you want to figure out whether they're bartering or whether they're actually using money, there's no a priori way to tell. You have to go and look and try and figure out their motivations. Try and figure out whether there's anything that they're using as a medium of exchange, And when you see things, passing hands, you have to figure out, is this a sale? Or is it some sort of religious ritual, or just a game, or what? And praxeology doesn't tell you that. You have to figure out what they're trying to do. Praxeology can't tell you whether there is any such thing as money in a given society. Only themology can do that. And themology doesn't do it, with a priori certainty. It's just, you can make mistakes interpreting people's motives. But praxeology will tell you what laws money will follow if there is money. It tells you what is involved in something's being money. And if it's not, if it is a case of money, then it has to do the things that are consistent with the nature of money. Now, what Mises student Hayek said in an essay called "The Facts of the Social Sciences" is that he thought that the reason that economics, or at any rate part of economics, is a priori, is that the objects of the social sciences are not defined in physical terms. They're defined in terms of people's attitudes. So, for example, money is not defined as green rectangular pieces of paper or round metal discs. There are no interesting laws about green pieces of paper or metal discs. No interesting sociological facts about those. Because you could use those as money, or you could wear them or hang them on your Christmas tree or whatever. Whether something is money or not is not a matter of its physical description. It's a matter of how people treat it. Whether people actually use it, treat it, regard it as a medium of exchange or not. And so what Hayek said is, well, the facts of the social sciences, and he went beyond merely economics. He thought, for example, the concept of a weapon, which he would say was an anthropological concept. And the concept of a weapon is not a purely physical description either. This could be a weapon. If I, used it as a weapon, it could be a weapon. What makes it a weapon is not its particular shape. What makes it a weapon is, how I plan to use it. So Hayek thought that the things we're interested in the social sciences are all things that are defined in terms of human attitudes toward them. And so he thought it's no wonder that logically various things follow about people's human attitudes towards something once we know that it is money or a weapon or whatever. Now there's controversy about the relationship between Hayek and Mises on this question. Hayek later in life used to say that he had never been an a priorist, which might or may not be true depending on exactly what he was intending to mean by a priorist. But certainly if you look at early articles like The Facts of the Social Sciences, clearly he's enunciating a view that's very much like Mises, that you can know a lot of economic facts, you can know a lot of things about economic reality, but simply by conceptual reasoning. When he was asked exactly what the difference was between him and Mises, he would always point to this early article he wrote called Economics and Knowledge, which he says that he intended as a criticism of Mises. Now he doesn't openly present the article as a criticism of Mises. He presents it primarily as attacking various general equilibrium theorists and so forth. But he says that he also intended his criticisms to be criticisms of Mises. And what he says in that article is that simply from these various a priori facts about the nature of individual choice, nothing follows about the economy as a whole unless you add premises about how human knowledge works and how people learn and how they adjust their behavior in the light of new knowledge. He says you cannot understand the economy unless, in addition to these facts about how Robinson Crusoe would behave, you also include facts about how people adjust their knowledge in response to other things. And he says that he intended this as a criticism of Mises. That he thought that what he was trying to say was that a priori truths about human action couldn't get you much in the way of economic conclusions. Even though he thought those were genuinely a priori truths, they couldn't get you much in the way of economic analysis unless you supplemented them with as he thought, empirical facts about how human knowledge works. And so the famous story goes that he gave this with some trepidation to Mises. And Mises read it and said, great, great, very good. And so Hayek was baffled because that, well, I was afraid he was really going to hate this as a criticism of him. He seems to agree with it. But, he was afraid to ask. And so ever since then, there's been this big dispute as to whether Hayek misunderstood Mises or Mises misunderstood Hayek or what. There are different theories. One theory is that Mises was just being polite, that he saw that Hayek was departing from his views, but he thought, oh well. Another interpretation is that Hayek had misunderstood Mises, that Mises had never intended these purely a priori truths to be enough to explain actual human economy, but you always had to supplement them with empirical, in the sense of phenomenological, understandings of what was going on, and that therefore the view that Mises thought he was developing in defiance of the view that Hayek thought he was developing in defiance of Mises was Mises' view anyway. Some people think that. Other people think, no, what Mises didn't realize is that Hayek thought this additional knowledge stuff wasn't a priori. Israel Kirzner, I think, has the view that Mises thought that these facts about individual human choice had to be supplemented with facts about the nature of human knowledge, but that these facts too were a priori, that they were built into his conception of action, and that he had a richer conception of action than the one Hayek was working with. Anyway, there's this dispute, but however you interpret the dispute, it's at most a disagreement about the scope of a priori reasoning, about how much of economics can be done a priori. But the core, at least in those early articles of Hayek's, the core of individual choice at any rate remains a priori. Later on, Hayek became more influenced by Popper, and so didn't want to stress so much the difference between the natural and the social sciences, because he came to think that the positivists had been misrepresenting the natural sciences anyway. And so he became sort of a Popperian. But of course, Friedman thinks of himself as a Popperian too, and Friedman says, oh, Hayek never really became a Popperian. Hayek remained an a priorist to the end of his days. So, Hayek may look very Popperian from the standpoint of Mises, but he looks very Misesian from the standpoint of a real Popperian. Okay, what is the status of these praxeological truths? Where do they come from? Are they imposed on the world by the categories in our mind, as Mises at least sometimes talks as though he thinks, and that's an idea he gets from Kant. I mean, Kant at least sometimes talks that way, although Kant talks more than one way too, but at least sort of the standard mainstream reading of Kant is that our mind just comes hardwired with certain categories. Bertrand Russell famously compared this to having blue spectacles you can never take off. So everything always looks guaranteed to look blue because you can't take off your blue glasses. So likewise, on this interpretation of Kant, everything looks as though it operates in accordance with principles of space and time and causality, because the structure of our mind is like having space-time causality goggles we can't take off. And so when Mises talks like that, it's as though we've got these economic goggles we can't take off, that all our experience of human behavior is guaranteed to be presented in a form that's consistent with economic law, because we necessarily structure our experience in economic terms. Now, there's dispute about whether that's precisely Mises' view or not. There's dispute about whether that's precisely Kant's view or not. But at any rate, that's a standard reading of both of them. By contrast, and that position is called impositionism. Our mind is imposing on reality these logical categories. And the opposite view is called reflectionism, according to which this logical structure of reality is out there in the world. It's not in our mind. The world really is structured that way. The world really is structured in terms of space, time, causality, and behavior really is structured in terms of economic law. And our minds don't impose that on the world. They get it from the world. We have this ability to grasp, to recognize these patterns in the world. And that's the view that Rothbard held. he said that he thought that we should think of these as laws of reality rather than laws of thought. And he took a more Aristotelian view as opposed to the Kantian view. And more recently, Barry Smith, from whom I'm getting these terms, impositionism and reflectionism, has defended the reflectionist view. Closely related to this is the notion of polylogism, which is a view that there can be different logics. This is something that Mises spends, the huge opening chunk of human action. You open it. Here's a treatise on economics. The first 100 pages is philosophy, and a huge chunk of that opening section is devoted to this question of polylogism. Are there different kinds of logic for different people, different individuals, different groups? This was a popular theory at the time he was writing. You might argue that, in certain forms of postmodernism it's still around. You found in certain forms of Marxism there's dispute as to whether Marx himself thought this or not. But some Marxists held that there were different logics. There was a bourgeois logic and a proletarian logic. And some of the Nazi theorists thought that there were an Aryan logic versus Jewish logic. So the idea is that different groups think in accordance with different logics. And Mises thought that this view was in part politically and economically motivated. That if the Marxist or the Nazi theoretician comes up with this description of how the society is going to work, and you say, well, wait a second, what you're proposing violates economic law, it's going to be a failure, they could turn around and say, well, that may be true for you operating according to your bourgeois logic or Jewish logic, but according to proletarian logic or Aryan logic, it works out just fine. And so it's a way of sort of dismissing objections based on logic or anything logically grounded. And so Mises spends a lot of time attacking this. But polylogism, this view of multiple logics, is really ambiguous. It might be a descriptive claim, a claim that different people do in fact operate in accordance with different logics. That would be consistent with thinking that one of them is right and the other ones are wrong. So you might think there's only one correct logic, but not everyone thinks in accordance with it. Our group thinks in accordance with the correct logic, but there are other groups that, they're just irrational and they think in accordance with the wrong logic. We're calling that descriptive polylogism. The view that as a matter of descriptive facts about the world, people think illogically. Normative polylogism would be the stronger view that there are all these different logics and they're all equally valid. My logic is valid for me and your logic is valid for you. Mises rejects both of them, but they are different views. But you might worry that impositionism and reflectionism both open the door to polylogism. If you're an impositionist, you think that the world out there doesn't have any logical structure in its own right. It's all a matter of what our minds impose on it. And although our minds impose this structure on it, maybe creatures of a different kind impose some different kind of structure. And Mises sometimes talks that way. He sometimes says, we don't know how this might appear to non-human beings who might be imposing a different logical structure on their experience, but we don't have to worry about them. But you might think, well, why don't we have to worry about them? If you really think that the world seems logical or behavior seems economic or whatever, only because these categories are being imposed on it by our minds, then you might think other minds could impose different categories, in which case it seems to open the door to polylogism again. You might think you could escape from it by appealing to reflectionism, but there again you might have the worry, well, if there's this logical truth out there, it's not here in our minds, it's out there in the world, and our minds can just try to receive it. Well, couldn't some minds succeed in receiving it and other minds fail? Maybe there's a logical structure out there, but my mind is too screwed up to grasp it. So when I try to get it, I really get a different structure instead, and so I behave irrationally. And the problem is that if people do really behave according to different logics, the worry then might be that different laws of economics apply to them. You might expect me to choose my top valued preference, but if I operate according to a different logic from you, I might choose my second valued preference first. And then, there'd be no way of describing my action in accordance with Austrian economics. Now, I think that Frege and Wittgenstein offer a kind of solution to this worry. Frege, I think, lays part of the solution. Wittgenstein completes it. Frege was worried about something called psychologism, which is the view that reduces logic to psychology, that treats logical truths as if they were really a variant of some sort of psychological generalizations. And in fact, this is something that Mises is worried about too. Mises talks about it. In fact, Mises criticizes some of his Austrian predecessors for making this mistake. An example would be one of his predecessors, one of the very first Austrian economists, Friedrich Wieser, who claimed that the law of diminishing marginal utility was grounded on something called Gauss's law of the satiation of wants. Now remember, the law of diminishing marginal utility says that you value the first unit of a good, you get more than the second, and you value the second unit more than the third, and so on. And Gauss's law of the satiation of wants says that you get the most pleasure out of the first unit of something you get, and you get less pleasure out of each subsequent one. So, you really enjoy your first scoop of ice cream, but you're a little less hungry after your second scoop and a little less after your third, and so each scoop you enjoy a little bit less. And Wieser had said, well, that's why the law of diminishing marginal utility is true. The reason you value each additional unit less is that you get less of a kick from it. You're getting satiated. So finally you're just sick of the thing. And Mises had argued this was a total mistake. These two are unrelated. That Gauss's law is an empirical law. It could be false. Sometimes it is false. Sometimes you eat a little bit and the first spoonful actually whets your appetite for more. And so, and Wieser says that. He says, well, this isn't perfectly true because sometimes, first your appetite actually gets stronger for a while, then it goes off. And Mises said, no, the law of diminishing marginal utility is purely a logical point. That you always apply the first unit of a good to your first most urgent want. Otherwise, it wouldn't count as your first most urgent want. We wouldn't call it your first most urgent want if it wasn't the one that you wanted to apply the first unit of the good to. So it's got nothing to do with this satiation. So this is just confusing a praxeological principle with a thymological or psychological principle. And this is very similar to what Frege was worried about, confusing logic with psychology. There are people who had said that to say that P implies Q just means that human minds naturally tend to pass from believing P to believing Q. And Frege attacked this, and it was confusing laws of holding true with laws of being true. And that logic was not a physics of thought, but an ethics of thought, because it was a physics of being. Frege was a reflectionist. He thought that logic is out there structuring the world. But Frege gave strong arguments against normative polylogism, the view that that there are multiple logics and are all equally okay. But Frege didn't really quite explain how to get rid of descriptive polylogism. Might be there's only one right logic, but still some people think illogically. What Wittgenstein came up with is the idea that we can't really make sense of an action unless we see it as conforming to logic. And by extension, we can't make sense of an action unless we see it as conforming to economics. So for example, you can't find cases, and he gives this example, he gives an economic example. You can't find cases of buying and selling that violates economic laws. Because if they did violate economic laws, we wouldn't call it buying and selling. If someone was accepting less in exchange for more, that showed it wasn't just a sale at all, it was something else. He gives this example of people who sell wood, stacks of wood by the height, and don't care about the area of ground covered. And they'll pay much more money for a tall, narrow pile than for a short, wide pile, even though they could easily rearrange it. You point this out to them and they're unmoved. And so it seems as though they're violating praxeological law. But Wittgenstein says, well, the only way that you can interpret this as a sale and interpret the coins that they're giving in exchange for this wood as money and all that is insofar as it accords with these economic laws that govern sales and money. Otherwise, you've got no reason not to treat it as a religious ritual or something. They might say that they're buying and selling, but the only test you have for what the words mean is how they use them. So likewise, he thinks that nothing counts as an inference unless it conforms to logic. Nothing counts as an action unless it conforms to the laws governing the nature of action. Well, this leads Wittgenstein to reject both impositionism and reflectionism. He doesn't reject them in those terms because he hadn't had the opportunity to hear Barry Smith. But what he says is that the mistake of both impositionism and reflectionism is they think of logic as a constraint on something inherently illogical. Impositionism says, there's the world out there without any logical structure, and our minds come along and impose logical structure on the world. And reflectionism says, here are our minds without any logical structure. The world comes along and imposes logical structure on our minds. Wittgenstein thinks neither of those makes any sense. We can't make sense of the idea of something that doesn't have logical structure. And this is also where he thinks Kant goes wrong. You can't talk about anything that lies outside the limits of logic because we can't make sense of such a thing. And so he concludes with the line, we cannot think what we cannot think. So if we cannot think, we cannot say either. So we cannot meaningfully entertain the hypothesis, either that there's a world out there that doesn't conform to our logical categories, or that there are other minds out there that don't conform to our logical categories. And Hayek makes a very similar point in one of these early praxeological essays. He says, you can't conceive of a mind that's fundamentally different from our own, because we use the word mind to talk about the kinds of creatures that have minds like ours. If there's something that moved around and made noises, but couldn't be understood in terms of praxeology, we wouldn't call it an agent. It's just part of what agency is. Okay, we've got brief time for questions. Yes?
Okay, it's fairly well known that Ayn Rand was thoroughly disgusted at that drawing of terms by Immanuel Kant. Okay, what specifically did she object to, and as a second part, how could she approve of Mises if he admired her?
Well, there are several things about Kant that she disapproved of. In this context, the relevant thing here that she would have disapproved of is this notion that we don't have contact with reality as it really is, that our minds are imposing these categories on reality. She didn't like that in Kant. She didn't like it in Mises. So that wasn't what she liked about Mises. She forgave Mises that because she liked the rest of it. She liked the whole economic edifice. But if you read her marginal comments on human action, which you can get, she was very unhappy with Mises' conception of praxeology as she understood it. Yeah.
You said that there's historicism and positivism that believe that Apriorism is invalid as a sole means to come to truth or knowledge.
Well, I don't think anyone thinks it's a sole means, but they thought that it wasn't a means at all. That there was no a priori route to any kind of truth.
Okay, so they thought that you would need to at least combine that with empiricism. But Mises,
Well, it's not a matter of combining it. I'm not sure anyone, and there's probably someone in the history of philosophy who thought that everything worth knowing can be known a priori, but none of these people think that. The question is that most of these people think that there's no or virtually no, apart from logic and mathematics, there's nothing that you can know a priori. And Mises thinks that there's a lot of important stuff you can know a priori. Well, certainly not everything. You can know praxeology a priori, but you can't know anyone's individual motive a priori.
would Mises say that you can know that all bachelors are married a priori solely on the basis of apriorism?
Yeah.
My question would be this then. Saying that all bachelors are married means, all bachelors aren't all people who aren't married. And that's like, this seems obvious and so forth. But that presupposes, static state of time. So, for instance, how do I know what the word bachelor means? It presupposes knowledge of the word bachelor. And so my question is, isn't it possible that perhaps you can't necessarily know what all of us in the city know how bachelor are married, but how do we know what bachelor is? So to come to that derivation or arrive at that sort of knowledge, we need to consider time, I believe, perhaps dynamically, and note that perhaps through empiricism, we would perhaps need to know, that's perhaps one of the important inputs into that knowledge that all bachelors are not married.
Well, what we know a priori is not that the word bachelor refers to people who are unmarried. That's certainly not something you can know. What that particular noise refers to is not something you can know a priori. But once you know that meaning, once you know what it means, then you don't need to know. You don't need any further information in order to know that all bachelors are unmarried. That's why I said that a priori doesn't mean prior to something you could know without ever having any experience. It's not that if you raise a baby in a sensory deprivation tank, it's not going to come up with all bachelors are unmarried. It's not going to come up with Jack Squad.
With the bachelor example, though, does it not presuppose knowledge of the bachelor thing, and therefore there is now based on a combination of positivism perhaps and Apriorism?
Well, Wittgenstein would say that in order to know bachelors are unmarried, you have to have the concept of bachelor. In order to have the concept of bachelor, you've got to have some ability to identify bachelors in real life. Not perfectly, but you just have no way whatever of finding out or telling whether someone is married or not. You can't recognize marriage when you see it, no matter how closely you investigate. Then he would say you don't really have the concept. So you have to have experience of the actual social world in order for your term bachelor even to mean anything, he thinks. But once you've got the term bachelor, once you have succeeded in meaning something by it, then you don't have to go and poll all the individual bachelors further to find out if they're married or not.
Can we really say that we have knowledge solely on means of Apriorism? I'm just asking for the...
Well, if once you have the concept and know it, then you don't need anything more than that to know this other thing. Then it's the move from that to the other thing that's the a priori part. Yeah?
I'm kind of with Craig here. It doesn't seem a priori at all. It seems deductive. If you just make a priori equal to deduction, then I guess you could say that, but it doesn't seem very a priori to me. It just seems like we have knowledge about the universe. We use logic to process that knowledge and come up with new conclusions. But that's deduction. That's logic.
No, but from the fact that knowing the concept enables you to deduce this, it's not a matter. It's not that you know some empirical fact that enables you to deduce some further empirical fact. Knowing a concept isn't to know a concept. To know what a concept means isn't to know an empirical fact.
Okay, so
now you need empirical experience in order to get the concept, but just having once you have the concept, that's sufficient for you to be able to tell about concerning the statement all bachelors are unmarried. You can tell whether that's true or false, and your ability to tell that is simply based on your knowledge of the concept. So that's the sense in which it's a priori.
Either what you know is about the real world or it's not. In this case, it's not really. It's just a definitional thing. Bachelors
well,
sound. And
it's about the real. There really are bachelors out there, and they really are unmarried.
Are we postulating that though? Are we postulating the existence of at least one bachelor in all bachelors are unmarried?
No, but even if you don't know whether they're already bachelors, if you know that all bachelors are unmarried, then your statement refers to them. Even if you don't know which ones they are, you are genuinely succeeding in saying about that group of people that they're unmarried.
Even if they don't exist.
No, I said if there are any, you don't have to know whether there are any.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So this statement says nothing about reality until you know whether there actually are any.
No, I don't know. There's a difference between what it says and what you know it says. If I say that Superman can fly, I've thereby said of Clark Kent that he can fly, even though I don't know that Clark Kent is Superman. So I don't. what we can say goes beyond what we know, because the world is objective, it's out there. That's why our sayings always have implications beyond what we know. That's both why language is useful and why it gets us into trouble. Okay, I think we better stop the formal portion there.